Hi, I'm Dan Fay, the Research and Development Coordinator for Stirling Coast Farmers. Welcome to our presentation on soils extensions. The Soils Extension Project is funded by the National Landcare Program. The aim of this project is to extend and observe long-running field trials where the impact of what is happening within the trial often extends past the funded period of the initial trial. So, when you're talking soil science, things in the soil tend to change very gradually. Projects like this allow us at SEF to examine what is happening beyond the original scope of the trial. Within this project, we have focused on 3 separate long-term amelioration trials. The first trial is based at Kendenup and is a lime source trial. Here, on the Mackie property, we aim to examine the effectiveness of lime from different sources. There was 5 different lime sources included within the trial. One was from Bornholm, Denmark, Lancelin, Redgate, and Welco. Along with this, there was a nil control. And additionally to this, there was a 3 times lime equivalent rate put out at 6 tonnes a hectare. Each of these limes have a different neutralising value. Each of the rates were applied, so the neutralising value was equalised out to an even 2 tonne a hectare of what was used as the baseline lime source. So, for example, if Bornholm had a neutralising value of 1.2 and Denmark had a neutralising value of 0.8, they were put out at different tonnages to equalise that neutralising value. So, in effect, you would hope to see a similar effect across each lime type. This was so we could examine the effectiveness of limes from differing sources. The lime was applied in 2015, and for the first 5 years of the project, very little yield differential was observed. This is not uncommon given that liming and lime applications, when surface applied, are very slow acting and slow to diffuse through the soil. So there was no differential observed between the limed plots and the control plots. In addition, the baseline pH within the paddock was quite high, so you were often going to observe smaller changes that may not be picked up in yield. In the 2021 season, however, they showed that there was no significant difference between the lime sources. However, there was a separation between these lime sources and the control, suggesting that the lime was having an effect finally on yield. This separation, like I said, was not between the different lime sources, but the fact that where the lime had been applied compared to where it hadn't been applied, that is where you're finally picking up a yield differential. And within this, the Bornholm lime and the Welco lime sources yielded significantly less than the other lime sources. So, the Denmark lime, the Lancelin lime, and the Redgate lime all yielded significantly higher than the control, whilst the Bornholm lime and the Welco lime yielded substantially less than the other lime sources, but yet they yielded slightly higher than the untreated control. The pHs recorded in 2019 showed no significant change from the baseline levels recorded in 2015. However, in 2021, there was an observed change in pH level at the surface level, so that is 0 to 10 centimetres. As you can see at the map that is displayed, there is no distinct trend within the paddock as to where the pH levels vary. And it is not like we are seeing distinct lines between the lime sources that have fixed the pH. Rather, it is where you have averaged it across the paddock that we are seeing marginal changes in pH level. The Kendenup lime source trial will continue to be monitored throughout the future, and hopefully as time goes on we might be able to see a more pronounced effect between the differing lime sources. The next trial we observed was also at Kendenup. This was a nil-disturbance trial. This trial was looking at essentially whether 2 different types of nil-disturbance systems could alleviate non-wetting soils on forest gravels. Forest gravels are traditionally very non-wetting. This is due to the fact that the gravel aggregate and the organic matter that tends to coat this gravel aggregate is repellent to water sources. In Kendenup in 2016, 2 alternative seeding systems were used to seed into these very non-wetting gravel soils, and the formal trial ran until 2019, after which we continued to monitor it. A disc seeder, a tynes seeder were both used in a no-till, no-disturbance manner. And then on top of this, a full disturbance prior to tynes seeding was utilised as a comparison. The full disturbance was induced by a scarifier between 2016 and 2017, then a deep ripper in 2018 and 2019. Over the 4-year span of the active trial, the 2 no-till treatments resulted in no yield differential. That is, that the tynes seeder and the disc seeder performed equally well at alleviating non-wetting within the forest gravel soils. The full disturbance treatment resulted in a higher cumulative yield over the lifespan of the project. However, this yield gain was predominantly driven by the disturbance performing better in extreme years, that is, years of extreme waterlogging and years where it's been extremely dry. This is likely a result of the deep ripping and the scarification of the soil, allowing roots to get down deeper earlier in the dry years, and allowing for water to push through and move through the profile easier in wet years. So, where the nil disturbance suffered in these extreme years, the full disturbance performed quite well. The nil disturbance techniques improved plant establishment in seasons where there was a dry start or that was a typical autumn break. But there was no advantage in plant establishment when crops were seeded into soil that was at field capacity. Whilst the cumulative yields of the nil disturbance treatments were similar, the tynes seeder and the disc seeder performed better on different crop types and under different environmental conditions. This shows that even within nil disturbance, although you do get an advantage at improving establishment and alleviating non-wetting, there is still selective issues within this. For example, the disc seeder performed very well when field peas were sowed compared to a tynes seeder, whereas cereals, the tynes seeder tended to perform better than the disc seeder. As we've continued to monitor this trial, we have found that the disc seeder and the tynes seeder in a nil disturbance system have performed equally as well as each other, whilst the full disturbance prior to seeding is really dependent on the environmental conditions. Soil compaction, which the full disturbance system would alleviate, would work better if there was a controlled traffic system in place, where full disturbance could be tactically used one in every few years. However, where there is not a controlled traffic system in place, the full disturbance system could not be used selectively within a nil disturbance rotation. The final trial we've been examining is a Takalarup lime rate by deep ripping trial. The lime by ripping trial was established in 2019 and ran until 2021. The trial was set up to investigate the effect of deep ripping with inclusion plates on the efficacy and dispersion of lime into acidic subsoils of a sandy duplex when applied to the surface. The treatments included lime sourced from commercial lime pit applied at 5 tonne a hectare, and lime sourced on farm from an on-farm lime seam applied at 12 tonnes per hectare. Both treatments were deep ripped alongside unripped controls and an untreated control where no lime and no ripping was applied. There was no significant increase in yield where the surface lime was applied and incorporated with a deep ripper, irrespective of the lime source. That is, both lime sources, when deep ripped, performed equally as well as each other. Surface applied lime, when compared to the untreated control, performed only marginally better in cumulative yields across the 2 seasons. This shows that there is quite a large tillage effect taking place within these plots. However, Where the deep ripping was applied with nil lime, these plots did not perform as well as where the deep ripping was applied with lime. This shows that even within the first 2 years of the project, the lime is having a positive effect on yield. In 2021, the pH was measured where the 12 tonne a hectare of farm lime was applied. This 6.7 off the rip line and a pH of 7 on the rip line at a depth of 10 to 30 centimetres, where the starting pH was recorded at 6.15. This shows that even within 2 years, there has been an improvement in pH, both on the rip line, where the inclusion plates would have worked the lime down into that acidic subsoil, although as you can see with a starting pH of 1.65, that is not particularly acidic. Over time, and over the span of 2 years, the lime has dispersed throughout the soil profile and moved away from that rip line. In 2021, pH was measured where the 12 tonne a hectare of the Willis farm lime was applied. The original pH measured was 6.15 within these plots at a depth of 10 to 30 centimetres. The pH was measured on the rip line and off the rip line, as we were trying to examine how or if the lime had moved laterally within this time, improved pH outside of the rip line. This is because by using inclusion plates, the lime is essentially worked down into the soil along a single rip line. Where you might have a gap of 50 centimetres between two rip lines, we wanted to examine whether the soil acidity had been neutralised within these rip lines. What we found was that at a depth of 10 to 30 centimetres, the pH was measured at 7 within the rip line and 6.7 between the rip lines. So both between the rip lines and within the rip line had increased the pH between 2019 and 2021. When interviewing the farmer and host Clint Willis, he said that as a standard practice on their property now, they will be using 12 tonne a hectare of lime sourced on farm and deep ripping it into the soil. He said that by using such a high rate of lime, they were able to get a result quickly, and by working it deep into the soil with a deep ripper, they were able to improve their subsoil acidity. They had found across their whole program, where they have been liming and now using clay over the past 3 to 4 seasons, they have found that they are already seeing vast improvements on land of which they had limed. One side issue that he had noted was that where they had limed though, they were seeing a higher presence of snails. This is likely due to snails thriving in alkaline soils. Clint stated that he will be happy to continue liming and is hoping to cover his whole program with at least 12 tonnes of farm sourced lime and working it in with a deep ripper. On top of this, the Willis family are moving towards a controlled traffic system where they will continue the deep rip, but due to their controlled traffic system, they hope that they will only be ripping when they're applying their lime and then every 4 to 5 seasons after that. The Takalarup lime trial shows the effectiveness of using higher rates of lime even if the lime is not of the equivalent quality of, say, a commercially sourced lime, and that soil pH can be improved relatively rapidly if the rate of lime applied is high. We will continue to monitor this. Trial site going forward, and hopefully, as we get more and more data coming in over the next 4 to 5 years, we will be able to ascertain the true effect of whether deep ripping plus high rates of farm-sourced lime can drive yield production compared to deep ripping plus lower rates of higher quality commercially sourced lime. Thank you for listening to the presentation.
Understanding the economics of new on-farm management decisions is crucial for farmers and crucial for increasing adoption of new management practices. Their farms are their livelihoods. It's not simply good enough to show the environmental benefits of implementing certain practices, such as those for improving soil health. They also need to see that implementing any new practice is an economically viable decision. Investment through the National Landcare Program allowed Sterling's to Coast farmers to conduct an economic analysis of the 3 trial sites described by Dan just now. There are numerous sources of lime available to farmers, and choosing the right one can sometimes be difficult. Important considerations such as the neutralising value and transport costs are important in these decisions. For example, a lime source with a lower neutralising value will need to be spread at higher rates than a high quality lime source that has a higher neutralising value. This then has flow-on impacts on the cost due to the amount of product that's then required to be spread out on the paddock and the transport costs as well. As discussed by Dan, the Sterling's to Coast farmers Kendenup lime sources trial aimed at evaluating a number of different lime sources across a number of years. The trial ran from 2017 through to 2021. 5 different lime sources were trialled, 3 relatively local to the south coast and 2 further afield at Redgate and Lancelin. The local lime sources had a lower neutralising value, but the transport costs were significantly reduced. An economic analysis was undertaken for each treatment across all years of the trial. It is important to note that the variable costs outside of the cost to implement the treatments all remain the same across all treatments. For example, these were fertiliser, chemical and operational costs. Overall, the results showed that Denmark-sourced lime was the most profitable. Of note, it also had the lowest treatment cost, but only marginally compared to the other 2 locally sourced limes. The Walco lime was the second most profitable, and the least profitable was the Lancelin lime, which had the highest treatment costs due to transport costs. This particular trial demonstrated that although local lime sources may have a lower neutralising value and therefore need to be spread at higher rates, this still may be more profitable than seeking lime with a higher neutralising value, but also with higher associated transport costs. Often liming occurs in conjunction with deep ripping by many farmers, but the driver of the yield increases as a result of this amelioration strategy is difficult to determine. For example, is it the liming that's causing the yield increase or the deep ripping? An economic analysis was conducted on the Sterling's to Coast farmers lime by deep ripping trial in South Sterling's. It is important to note that the treatment costs were absorbed into year 1 of the trial when looking at the results. In 2019, it was clear that the deep ripping was driving the increased yield. However, this didn't flow through to profitability in the first year due to the associated costs with implementing ripping and liming treatments. Of note, the 5 tonne of lime applied per hectare, which was only applied to the surface, yielded similar to the control. The 5 tonne lime applied yielded 4.2 tonnes per hectare, and the control with no lime or ripping yielded 4.29 tonnes per hectare. But it was the cost of the liming that drove down the profitability that you see in the graph in 2019. In 2020, it seemed that lime and ripped treatments in isolation, all combined, increased profitability almost equally compared with the control. Although you can see in the graph that ripping in isolation over liming in isolation was slightly ahead by $73 per hectare. Interestingly, across both years, there was very little difference in profitability between the locally sourced lime, so the lime that the Willises had sourced from their own property and spread at 12 tonne per hectare, in comparison with the Kendenup lime, which was spread at 5 tonnes per hectare. The ongoing debate on whether discs or tynes are better continues, with the economic analysis on the Sterling's to Coast Kendenup nil-disturbance seeding systems trial showing very mixed results. Between 2016 and 2019, yield results were collected from disc, tyne and scarify then tyne treatments. An additional RIP treatment was included in 2019. It was broadly assumed in this economic analysis that the cost to feed with discs and tynes were the same, as well as assuming that the variable costs across all treatments remain the same as well. However, the cost to scarify and to deep rip were definitely accounted for in this economic analysis. In 2017, seeding field peas with discs was certainly more profitable than with tynes. This is quite possibly due to the dry start experienced in 2017. Although it doesn't then explain why the better result was seen with tynes in 2018, where a dry start was also experienced. In 2019, the deep ripped and then tyne sowing treatment was the most profitable by over $200 per hectare, indicating that soil compaction at this site was very likely. As mentioned, overall, the trial showed no clear distinction in profitability between either the use of tynes or discs, so the debate continues. In summary of all the trials mentioned, they show that lime and deep ripping are important management considerations for both soil acidity and compaction. The yield data from these trials show that the management options do work, and the economic analysis shows that actively managing these constraints is also profitable. Acidity and compaction continue to impact on-farm productivity and profitability. An extension of information from long-term trials such as these will assist in further adoption of these sustainable practices. Sterling's to Coast Farmers would like to thank all the farmers involved in the project for their time and the use of their land. We'd also like to acknowledge the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment for the investment in this project through the National Landcare Program.